If only for a moment, it looked like Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler had actually found a ball, dare I say, maybe even two, after months or even years, in his case, of bending over to allow lawless rioters to control segments of his city and abuse anybody who gets in the way. It looked like this blind squirrel had finally found a nut. Maybe he was emboldened by his re-election. Now, I'm fully aware of the absurdity of this statement, but hear me out. In weird ways, Ted Wheeler is like the Donald Trump of Portland. They call him a Nazi, or at least Nazi adjacent. They call him a Klansman. They call him a fascist. They throw everything they have at him, and the polls show he has no chance to win, and yet he still pulls off a stunner, beating the odds and the pollsters on election day to win another term. And as insane as it is, Ted Wheeler was the reasonable choice, running against a woman who actually says, "I am part of the mob. I am Antifa." Ted Wheeler at least entertains the idea that Portland police have some role in defending the rights of the citizenry. So when the new ballsy Ted tweeted out this week, "Hey, I'm going to deploy police to take care of a mob of thugs and criminals," for a moment I thought, wow, what a gutsy move to gamble your political capital on the lofty goal of actually arresting criminals for crimes. But that is highly divisive in a city where an actual Antifa communist gets half the vote. And if you think it's unfair to call her a communist, fine. I'll be more precise. She's just a lady who wears a skirt celebrating history's most brutal communists, and it was only her campaign manager who was an actual communist, self-described and proud, blue check verified. That is half the vote in Portland. The people warning you of oppressive state violence are celebrating the guys who stacked the skulls to history's highest heights with just the wave of their dictatorial fingers. But like anything else with the leftist mob, stacking skulls or just otherwise abusing people is only bad when someone else is doing it. It's never bad when the mob is doing it because of their virtuous intent. So when Ted's police force showed up in North Portland this week to do a little law enforcement, this scene was the result.
Fuck you, I'm knocking the fuck out, bitch! You're too fucking good! You, specifically! I'm gonna knock you out!
It's always hard to tell these days if they're wearing masks for corona safety purposes or for just old-fashioned thuggery. It could be both, I suppose. They'll throw bricks at people, sure, but they're not monsters. They wouldn't spread the Rona while they do it. And it can be confusing, but this is the Portland usual if you're tracking teams. The fascists are the ones totally laying down for the mob and retreating. The anti-fascists are the ones threatening and beating their opposition in the streets. So standard Portland prevails despite that glimmer of courage from the mayor. How we got to the typical Portland scene of a mob running the city with impunity starts with, of course, what else? A claim of systemic racism that was actually a matter of personal choices and a total failure to take accountability for them. This latest Portland flashpoint surrounds the so-called Red House, a century-old home on North Mississippi Avenue. The Kinney family had owned the place outright, but in 2002 took out a loan against the house to cover legal expenses for a family member arrested in a deadly hit-and-run incident. And after 2016, the family failed to make payments on that loan. The family blames the loan being sold between different companies and confusion about who to pay. To be fair to the family, they had been current on their payments until the transfer between companies, and I can understand confusion, particularly if you're getting two different bills from two different companies, as the family alleges. But does that justify or explain 2 years of non-payment, especially when the family had received definitive communication clarifying to whom the money is owed in 2017? So for a full year after that letter was received, the family continued just not paying their bills until the home was foreclosed upon in 2018. The family has had multiple appeal attempts rejected in court, in part because they simply weren't paying their bills, and there's no easy legal argument around that, but also because the Red House family chose to represent themselves in court, making preposterous legal arguments claiming to be sovereign citizens not subject to U.S. law. It was multiple years of failure to pay before the home was foreclosed upon, and 2 more years of patience after the foreclosure while the family exhausted their nonsense legal arguments and enjoyed still extra protection of a coronavirus eviction moratorium. That argument too failed in court, but it did buy the family even more extra time. The family was finally evicted by a judge in September. The sheriff ordered the family to vacate the home, but they still hadn't. So 3 months later this week, it's happening by force. And despite all the years of patience, despite having every opportunity to correct the issue, Activists protesting the eviction say it's symbolic of systemic racism and entrenched inequality. So just to recap, systemic racism caused the deadly hit and run where a family member killed a guy. Systemic racism forced the family to take out these loans. Systemic racism caused them never to pay the money back. Systemic racism granted them a multi-year grace period to figure it out or form a contingency plan. And systemic racism forced the family to make terrible arguments in court for years and get away with it. Systemic racism, as usual, sounds like a great deal for the wildly irresponsible, not a tool of oppression, but that's what we're going with. If this family has to be brutally oppressed by the heavy hand of their own irresponsible decision-making, then everyone else in the neighborhood has to be oppressed too. As always, the communists will make everyone equal in their suffering. And so between that eviction notice in September and today, Portland's roaming mob of degenerates gave the federal courthouse downtown a rest and set up camp outside of this red house to protect the family from eviction. And of course, in supposedly protecting the community, they actually ransacked it. During those 3 months, Portland police received over 80 calls about this encampment regarding fights, disturbances, shots fired, threats, and other criminality, including blocking neighbors' access to their own homes. On Tuesday, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Department and the Portland Police moved to enforce that eviction order and claim the property for its rightful owners, raiding the home at 5 a.m., but encountering resistance, police arrested several for interference with the reclamation of the property and resisting arrest. Police cleared the home and established a physical barricade around it. Police were done by about 10 a.m. They asked the mob to be good boys and girls and not enter that property, but of course, as soon as police left, the mob tore down those barricades and repurposed them for their own use. They set up makeshift spike strips and blockaded the entire street with a dam of debris that looks like a tornado rolled through, and thus the CHAZ sequel was born. This one is called RAZ, the Red House Autonomous Zone, and just like Seattle, Portland has its own armed warlord of color named Morpheus, presumably because he dresses like the Matrix character, sort of like Morpheus meets Bane at a gay bar. Later on Tuesday, the police returned to get control of the situation, but that didn't happen. That's when you get the scenes that we saw earlier. Police and their vehicles were attacked physically with punches and kicks and bricks thrown and tires slashed. The mob covered one police vehicle windshield with a fire extinguisher, and the cop car just slowly and politely retreats. For a second, it looks like the driver might give it the old James Fields try and hit the gas, but don't get your hopes up. It doesn't happen. The police were beaten back, they retreated, and the mob celebrated their victory. And I can't believe these racist cops shirked a perfect opportunity to shoot so many people of color on sight, but maybe they were afraid of getting caught on all the cameras that were rolling. Still, despite that protection, the mob is outraged with everybody who was recording on their phones. The Razistanis are demanding the independent journalists on the scene delete their Twitter posts of the videos because the videos will endanger the mob of thugs, potentially subjecting them to identification and arrest. 80 recent police calls for terrorizing a neighborhood isn't endangerment. Blocking people from their homes isn't endangerment. Violently attacking people in the streets isn't endangerment, but posting video of the people doing it is. Journalism is supposedly a bigger threat than the people destroying the city, and that's why the mob won't stop with controlling the police. They have to control the flow of information too. And so the mob has issued a warning that nobody can film inside the autonomous zone without the consent of all those presented, and those who don't obey this order will face consequences. Funny how consent and property rights only matter when they're the mobs. What about the consent and property rights of the actual property owner whose home you're destroying? What about the consent and property rights of the neighbors? Did you get their permission before you obstructed their homes with spike strips? No, of course not. Self-serving hypocrisy is the only thing these people do well. They don't understand a language of reason. They only understand a language of force. It's how they advance themselves, and it's the only way to turn them back. But unfortunately, if you are one of those neighbors in Portland, Ted Wheeler is the tip of that spear of justice for you. So don't bother waiting around. Just start sharpening your own. After what appeared like a moment of actual law and order, a moment of actually doing his job and sending the police to uphold the law and defend people's rights, Ted Wheeler is back to his usual self, experimenting daily with just how wide a man's cheeks can be spread. After pulling the cops out, Ted posted a series of tweets on Tuesday night that impossibly pissed everyone off. He says, "We all agree that our nation's systems and structures are racist and require significant reform. Nonetheless, He's authorizing the Portland police to use all lawful means to end the occupation and hold the criminals accountable. There will be no autonomous zone in Portland, he says. If the systems are racist, then why are you deploying them? You've been in office for 4 years. You just got 4 more. What time is make the cops not racist o'clock, Ted? When are you getting around to that? If there will be no autonomous zone, why did you let the mob run downtown with vandalism and destruction all summer long? If you can control it now, why didn't you control it then? And if you can control it, why is this autonomous zone only growing in the days since this tweet? The zone is multiple blocks and expanding. Reportedly, these militants actually have checkpoints for entry now. Despite this decay, the only police action since the retreat is to ask the mob nicely to stop. Here's the police chief with a video message on Wednesday with no plan of action, just telling people to stay away.
This occupation can be solved easily, and we ask those present at the barricades to leave them behind immediately. Allow the neighborhood to return to peace. Those without a need to enter should avoid the area for the time being.
Well, don't worry. Those of us without a need to enter will gladly stay away. You don't need to do any convincing there, but that's not the issue. What about those of us who do have a need to enter? What about the people who live there, whose lives are being held hostage by a mob of terrorists? And if you don't find this story frustrating enough, just stand by. There will be more, and it will get worse. Easy prediction here. In the end, not only will this mob takeover go unpunished, but it'll actually be rewarded. We're now days into it with city leadership too weak and hesitant to act, and the mob has stirred up enough sympathy to raise $250,000 for the family who owned the house. That's apparently the approximate value of the property. The new property owners have already signaled they're open to resolution and willing to work with the family to end the conflict. This is going to happen. Just watch. GoFundMe will buy this family's house back. But we're still all going to hear about how this irresponsible family, given the extra protection of a lawless mob of terrorists, is still somehow a victim of a racist system. At this point, where do I sign up for racism? Because if it means that all my debt is excused and the law doesn't apply to me, that's not a system of oppression. That's a sweet deal that I got to get for myself. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.